Hello everyone and welcome back to Rambling Through History. My name is Jacob, and today we're going to be talking about a Civil War battle that is often overlooked and overshadowed by the Battle of Gettysburg. And while the Battle of Gettysburg was a humongous turning point for the North and a large morale boost for the North, I believe this battle was greatly overshadowed and was greatly more important to the war effort. Now, this video is going to have a little more of my own opinion in it, and a little more of me rambling on about why I think this certain battle is particularly more important than the Battle of Gettysburg. If you do like this video and the way it was formatted, please let me know down in the comments, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification. And with that, let's get on with the video. After the spring of 1862, when the Confederates had lost Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Memphis in Tennessee, and New Orleans in Louisiana, Vicksburg became the key remaining point of the defense of the Mississippi River. The capture of Vicksburg would yield the North control of the entire course of the river and thus enable it to isolate those Confederate states that lay west of the river from those in the east. Vicksburg was ideally suited for defensive purposes, however. It was situated in high bluffs along the river and was protected on the north by a maze of swampy bayous. The Confederate batteries on the bluffs could outgun any Union ship on the river. A Union naval expedition using ironclads from May to June of 1862 to subdue the Confederate batteries failed, as did an attempt to take the city by land from the north by General William Sherman, and an attempt by Grant to cut a canal around Vicksburg that would divert the river. After this string of frustrating failures, Grant conceived a bold move that would enable him to take the city using the high ground approaches from the east, well behind Confederate lines. Moving his army of 40,000 troops to the west bank of the river, he marched south along it for a considerable distance until he could recross the river at Brunswick, which lay about 30 miles south of Vicksburg. His army recrossed to the east bank of the river by means of a Union fleet, which, under the command of Admiral David D. Porter, had run south past the batteries at Vicksburg. Once across the river, Grant quickly began moving northeast. Through this meant abandoning his already tenuous supply lines and feeding his troops off the surrounding enemy countryside. His forces took Port Gibson on May 2nd, reached Grand Gulf on May 3rd, and prevented the small Confederate army of General Joseph E. Johnston near Jackson from linking up with the Vicksburg forces. Vicksburg's commander, General John C. Pemberton, led his forces out in an effort to link up with Johnston, but met Grant moving westward, and his forces were forced to return to the city. On May 18th, Grant arrived in the rear of Vicksburg, within which Pemberton's 30,000 troops were isolated. After two assaults in mid-May failed, Grant settled down to methodical siege tactics while augmenting his forces. He controlled all the approaches to the city, and by early June the Confederate garrison was desperately short of ammunition and on the brink of starvation. Pemberton then surrendered the city on July 4th, 1863. The first point I'm going to be making about the Battle of Vicksburg is that it was absolutely vital for the Confederacy in the South. The amount of supplies that were moved back and forth from east to west, along with the economic importance of it, made Vicksburg one of the biggest points of why winning this battle was so important. President Lincoln even was quoted saying, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." And as you can see, even President Lincoln knew at this time that the true lifeline of the Confederacy was the Mississippi River. With this being said, communication and supplies from east to west would be completely cut off, allowing the Union forces in the west to hammer down on the Confederate forces, which would be completely cut off from any reinforcements or supplies that the east was formerly giving. Now, we can take a look back to the great economic portion of the Mississippi River. Today, over 500 million tons of goods are traded down the Mississippi River. As we see here, the Mississippi River is still a vital and crucial supply route throughout the South, and more so back in the 1860s. Trading by water was the cheapest and fastest way that there usually was, so this was an even more important trade route for those of the South. Now, the South was already being strangled by the Union blockade, and their economy was already collapsing. But with the complete shutdown of the Mississippi River, this will make the collapse come even sooner and make it even more devastating. The Battle of Vicksburg was won. The people of the North, including the President of the United States, celebrated with joy because they knew that the Mississippi River was one of the most important things that the South held. This helped renew the morale of the North for continuing the war, and now some would argue that the Gettysburg gave even more morale than Vicksburg, and I would have to agree. But I only agree with that because Gettysburg was closer to DC and the main population center of the North, so winning this battle seemed more life and death than the Battle of Vicksburg. But with the Battle of Vicksburg, it allowed the Union forces to move further inland to the south. One example of this would be General Sherman's March to the Sea, which caused massive amounts of economic damage that harmed the Southern war machine and the Southern people's will to continue the fight more. The Battle of Vicksburg, in my opinion, also caused more damage to the Southern armies. Now, the casualties and the amount of damage that the Confederates took at the Battle of Gettysburg were quite extensive, but in the end, General Lee was allowed to leave with most of his supplies and most of his army intact. They were so intact and well supplied that they continued fighting for 2 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, after the Battle of Vicksburg, over 30,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered, and while all of these soldiers were partitioned and let go, they left with no guns, no supplies, just with their heads down to spread the news of their terrible defeat. They also just got out of a long siege and were terribly starved, and with the Union blockade continuing to strangle the South, I find it less likely that many of these men made it back into any kind of fighting. Now, of course, some men did go back into fighting, but considering that their men were just starved and lost all of their supplies, I think it's safe to say that the Battle of Vicksburg created a more decisive defeat than Gettysburg. Now, one of the most important things that the Battle of Vicksburg did was allowed President Lincoln to firmly know that he had the right man for the job. 4 to 5 past generals in the East had little to no success in defeating General Lee or any of the armies there. Most of the time, they were utterly defeated, even though they outnumbered the Confederates. They were defeated many times in such a fashion. With the victory of Vicksburg, it showed President Lincoln that he had the general to end the war with, and with that victory, he moved General Grant to the east, and now the best Union general and the best Confederate general were going to face off. Past generals of the Union Army were too reserved and would not push but retreat, allowing more breathing room for the Confederates. This is what made General Grant different. He was very aggressive and knew that even if he lost battles and many men, that he had more men, more supplies, and just more brute strength to get him across the finish line and making the Confederates surrender. In a matter of weeks, hundreds of thousands of Americans lie injured or dead, but in the end, the constant pressure that he put onto the Confederate armies, and with knowing that they couldn't supply or even replace the men they had lost, led to the downfall of the Confederacy and the ultimate surrender at Appomattox. And with that, this will be the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for coming along with me and listening to me try a new format. I really enjoyed sharing my opinion because I was watching some documentaries and I came to realize that Vicksburg was greatly overshadowed and actually played a great role in allowing the Union to capitulate the South. But let me know and hear your thoughts. Do you agree with me or do you disagree with me? Let me know down in the comments. Once again, thank you all so much for coming and enjoying this video with me. Remember to like, subscribe, and have a wonderful day.